Welcome to the Diplowomen podcast, where we will be talking with and about incredible women mediators, facilitators, negotiators, ambassadors, peacemakers, peace builders, and more. I am Karma Ekmekji, and I will be your host in this journey of mainstreaming the women, peace, and security agenda into our lifestyles. With a focus on the Arab region, the Diplowomen podcast comes to you in collaboration with the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and is made possible by the generous support of UN Women. The Arabic subtitled video edition is available on the Diplowomen podcast YouTube channel. We're thinking out loud with Sara Minkara in this new episode of the Diplowomen podcast. Sara has been recently appointed as special advisor by US President Joe Biden on international disability rights at the US State Department. She is an internationally recognized champion for disability inclusion and individual empowerment. She is the founder of Empowerment Through Integration, which aims at providing critical life skills trainings to children with disabilities. Sara is a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School. Sara, thank you for being with us today at the Diplowomen podcast. It is an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Karma, and I'm excited to be with you today.
Sara, tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you've done so much over the years working on disability rights, on inclusion, but how did your own journey start, your childhood?
So I'm first going to introduce myself and introduce my story through a unique way, and then I'll dive into kind of the
Please go ahead.
I usually introduce myself this way because it allows for us to see kind of the different identities that we all hold. So I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a friend, I'm a colleague, I'm a neighbor, I'm a traveler, I'm a troublemaker. I love math, I love horses, I love coffee, I love to eat chicken, I love audiobook mystery thrillers. I'm a woman, I'm Muslim, I am blind, I'm a person with a disability, and I'm very proud of it.
And we are very proud of you. We're very proud of you.
Thank you. And, and I end with this point, being a person with disability and being proud of it. And, this was, to be honest, this is a big part of who I am and my journey and what my purpose is in life and why I've been able to focus. And it really stems from my personal experience of having become blind, and I became blind at age 7. Mm-hmm. And my older sister is also visually impaired, but my parents really focused on creating a space where we were empowered, we were included, and we were valued. And these are common themes that end up being part of my life and my purpose. But one important aspect is they did not allow society's expectations or lack thereof surrounding disability to ever enter the home, because what's the narrative surrounding disability? It's the charity pity narrative, but instead they really focus on having us live a full life and really push forward and be ambitious, etc. And ultimately that contrasted with what I saw out in the world, and that's what led me to kind of starting ETI and doing what I do right now.
Very inspiring, Sara, your story. You just gave us a minute, collapsed your whole, childhood into a minute. But I'm sure there were probably a lot of challenges along the way. No, I don't think anything in life comes easy. But particularly with your journey, what were some of the major obstacles you faced growing up? How did you overcome them? Did you face discrimination along the way?
Definitely, and I'll start with the last question. I definitely dealt with a lot of ableism. Unfortunately, the narrative surrounding disability is so strong in our world, in our societies, mm-hmm. and that seeps into all aspects of life. So we always say in the disability community that our greatest disability is how society sees us. Right. And so with that in mind, I've had a lot of obstacles. I would say a lot of technical obstacles of how the world is not accessible in many ways, but also adaptive obstacles, which is, I've had people say, well, you should be in my class because, you want to major in math and you're blind, or I remember I had a study abroad experience where the university was not willing to be accessible and I had to come back to and not be able to continue my study abroad experience. So I've had a lot of different obstacles in that sense, but I go back and say, because my parents really pushed us to, embrace all of who we are, and because they pushed us to have dreams, ambitions, and because they also taught us how to be advocate for ourselves. And to be honest, we need to know, like every single person with a disability needs to learn how to be advocate for themselves, because the world is not yet there where we're fully accepted and included.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how the world is unfair and how there's a lot of exclusion still, whether it comes to, peace and security, how to deal with conflict resolution, and beyond. But just to close the circle with your childhood, what was your turning point? I mean, when did you realize that this is what you want to dedicate your life to? I mean, yes, you're a person with disability, but of course you could have chosen to do something else, right? I mean, you could have, but you've really dedicated your whole life to this. And what was that point where you said, okay, I have a mission and I'm going to undertake this?
Really good question, because I was a math and an economics major in undergrad, and I was planning on doing a PhD in that field. And to be honest, that it would have been a much quieter life in many ways. But I ended up starting my nonprofit, and it was kind of, I don't want to say by accident, but it stemmed from this summer program that I had done with my friend and my classmate Mesa Murad in Tripoli, Lebanon. It was funded by the Clinton Foundation, and we were able to run this inclusive summer camp in Tripoli, Lebanon, where my parents are from. And it brought together blind and sighted kids, so kids with and without disabilities. And the purpose of the camp was to teach the value of inclusion. And I just saw how powerful the camp was, and the impact that it was on the kids, on the parents, on the community, and even for myself, because it was the first time that I actually told the world, I am blind and I'm proud of it. It was a big moment in my life too. And it was a successful summer, but I went back to my major, and then my thesis advisor, he was like, why are you applying to these PhD programs? Your eyes sparkle when you talk about the summer camp. And like, you should pursue that. That's where you're passionate. And it is, because I realized how privileged I was to have had a supportive, empowering system around me. But there's so many kids out there that I kept on seeing and interacting with that are not seen for who they are, and they're not valued. And I think that was my turning point, almost like this became my purpose. And even, I mean, on a personal level, yes, I do deal with, obstacles. I do deal with doubt. I do deal with imposter syndrome. I do deal with a lot of different things. But again, like I consider myself privileged with what I was given. So that was my turning point. But I want to kind of, mention that along the way, I had amazing people. I'll give you an example. Like, I had amazing teachers, like my math professor in college. He made the classroom so accessible. He was very articulate and explained things really well, and was really accommodating. But do you know what ended up happening? All my friends would say, Sara, which math class are you taking? Because the professor it becomes a better teacher. So it came to this point of the inclusion of all, the value for all. They benefited when I was in that class because the professor became a better math teacher, which is amazing, right?
It is. It is. There are two things you've mentioned that I want to focus on. The first is, you said Lebanon. Your parents are from Lebanon. Were you born and raised in the US? Did you visit Lebanon often? All these questions. Do you think growing up in America contributed to your achievements? Had you been living in the Arab world, had you been living in Lebanon, would Sara Minkara's path look any different? And the second question I want to ask you is about, or the second point I wanted to focus on was accessibility. You mentioned this word a number of times, and yes, accessibility is a major issue. I mean, persons with disabilities, especially living in conflict settings, face the issue of accessibility. So imagine, in our part of the world, accessibility is a huge issue for people with disabilities. I want to also talk a little bit about that. I know I have so many questions, so let's first start with Lebanon and your ties to Lebanon and how America contributed to your achievements.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, born and raised in the US, but we used to visit Lebanon every single summer growing up. Every single summer to visit extended family, and it was a big part of kind of my upbringing. And this is where I saw, the diversity in this world of how disability is seen. I definitely believe, because I was raised in the US, I was given the privilege of being able to depend on certain laws, right? There's the American with Disability Act, which the ADA, which allows for kids with disabilities to have access to inclusive education. Mm-hmm. So when I became blind age 7, I was able to still continue going to my public school system, the mainstream public school system. The school was required to make sure that the classrooms are accessible. Mm-hmm. And that in itself, when you have a law and policy to protect you, that allows you to really be able to advocate for yourself. Not to say, I go back to, but there will always be humans, and this is what we also need to address the narrative. There will always be individuals and humans that will see disability in the charity narrative, or less than narrative, or an added burden narrative. And I think that's something we need to be addressing as a global society. And that connects with your second question is, I look at accessibility from 2 lenses. One is the technical lens, which is how do you create an infrastructure that's accessible for all? Mm-hmm. But then also, how do you create a culture and an environment that is accessible for all? How do you create a culture where people with disabilities are seen as a value? They're not just seen, when you talk about peace, conflict, places of conflict and moments of, peace and security, we look at persons with disability kind of from the lens, this is the right thing to do, let's make sure we are protecting them, right? But I want to take a step further, and I want to talk about how do we make sure that we also see their value in this process? Mm-hmm. Not only protect them, but then how do we make sure we see people with disability through the lens of value? And when the global community, when humanity and individuals see people with disabilities as individuals with value, we from the get-go are going to want to create systems that are accessible and inclusive and make sure that they're part of the system. So this value-based narrative is a big part of why things our global society is not fully, we have challenges towards accessibility.
Absolutely, and we're going to get to some of the recommendations you have to address these challenges. But let me address the issue of peace and security. You are sitting, you have a front row seat. Sara, you have a front row seat sitting at the State Department to the peace and security agenda of the world, in a sense. You see the different conflicts that are happening. There's a lot of, instability currently in the world. And as you know, there's a Security Council Resolution 1325, which is a landmark resolution on women, peace, and security. Unfortunately, there's very little reference in Security Council Resolution 1325 and the subsequent resolutions that followed on, gender-specific needs of women with disabilities. These are not being met during or after conflicts. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And how do you view this? I mean, already, there's a huge struggle for including women on peace tables, and sadly, women with disabilities have not even been considered. And that's a reality. As harsh as that sounds, I have to say it, I have to articulate it. So how do you address some of these challenges? Are you thinking from where you're sitting about these issues? And what are some of the measures that we can take together collectively as a global society to address these issues?
That's a really good question. And yeah, women with disabilities are not even part of the conversation, are not even part of the kind of the framework. And that's actually something that I'm focusing a lot with my team on, is how do we make sure that, and it goes back to this point, is how do we make sure when we're talking about peace and security, we're talking about negotiations and peace processes, how do we make sure that, women with disabilities, persons with disabilities are part of the conversation, are sitting at the table, are seen as valued members like anyone else. But it goes back to, Karma, the whole point of, we, the world, are not yet seeing persons with disabilities as more than a human rights issue, and more than this is the right thing to do. We need to come to a point where we see persons with disabilities, women with disabilities, as part of the solution. Because let me tell you something, women in general, when they're part of the peace and security process, the solutions, the outcome are so much better than without women.
Absolutely.
Add that with women and disabilities, persons with disabilities themselves are the most creative and innovative and resilient individuals. The value that they can bring to the conversation is going to be really important. But again, we don't see them as points and individuals of value. And this is my biggest frustration when we talk about inclusion of persons with disability. It's not just the right thing to do. There's a value, and we're losing out on their value when we're not including them part of the process. So in order for us to really and this is a very abstract, conversation, but it is very much, it goes back to the core root of why we have all these issues around the challenges in the global community when it comes to inclusion and etc. So anyways, so I would say really promoting this value-based narrative across the board.
Absolutely. I still feel, as counterintuitive as this sounds, we're treating inclusivity in silos. We talk about, let's include women, let's include the youth, let's include this, but we don't look at it as one whole piece of the puzzle. I don't know what you think about that, but this is how I feel right now. I feel like we say inclusivity, but then we don't really act upon what we're saying.
That goes back to why the way I introduce myself with always around it. Every single person has multiple identities. There's so many intersectional ways of looking at humanity and the community that we're in. And like, to your point, yes, we silo. It's very ironic and very, we silo these different communities and identities, But again, it's to your point, we need to be looking at, when we're looking at women with these multiple different identities, women with disabilities of ethnic and religious minorities, women with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities with other, there's so many different identities that we can be looking at the individual, and we're not just one identity. And I think that is very harmful when we don't look at people with their multiple layers and identities that they're bringing forward. Again,
this is why intersectionality is so important right now, and it has to go beyond being a buzzword at the moment. We really need to look at that, put that intersectional lens at everything that we do. Sara, I wanted to ask you a question on legislation. You said earlier that the reason why America played a big role in your achievement is because of the legislation that exists in the US. How can you help other countries achieve that kind of legislation? I know in our part of the world, unfortunately, we're not there yet. There's a lot of accessibility issues. People with disabilities don't have the adequate legislation that is required. How can you contribute to that from where you're sitting at the moment?
That's a really good question. So first, most countries have actually ratified the CRPD, which is the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN Convention. So in technicality, there are some policy, there are some legislations in a lot of these countries. I think where the work is how do we support these countries with giving the how and the why and the importance of why we need to be addressing the person with disability community. And that's whether we're sharing best practices that we, the US, have, but then other communities and other countries have been able to bring forward, whether that's looking at solutions in a localized solutions that are tailored to the country and that we use design thinking innovation, because in a lot of spaces you hear, well, we don't have enough resources, right? But I truly believe when communities see the value in this legislation and want to implement, people will find ways to support, if that makes sense. So a big part of kind of the work that we're also trying to do is also bring forward that narrative change and bring forward that value-based narrative. Because again, when you have communities wanting to include persons with disabilities, they'll find solutions. So it's a combination of sharing best practices. It's a combination of giving any support that we can. It's a combination of bringing forward that value-based narrative. All of that will help kind of move towards and moving the conversation forward.
We spoke about, the importance of inclusion and peace building, but how far are we? How far are we right now from having an inclusive tomorrow?
We're far and close. So, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of work to be done. But I know right now, if you look at the global community, there are conversations around inclusion towards different identities, right? There are the fact that we are talking about the inclusion of women in peace and security process, right? I think all of these conversations are important. That people, the communities and the global community is becoming more aware. So I think that's a really great thing. But we're so far in the sense that when we're looking at inclusion, we tend to look at solutions from a very technical lens. Oh, let's make sure we, bring forward this technical solution to inclusion. But inclusion is not easy. And if it was easy, it would have been achieved, right? And I think we need to be looking at the core reasoning behind why inclusion hasn't been achieved when we're looking at solutions. I think that's why, to your point earlier, when we're siloing the different identities, right? Or like, oh, that's inclusion of this group and then this group and this group. We're not really digging into the core aspect of why there's marginalizations of different communities, why inclusion hasn't been achieved. I would say the adaptive work still needs to get done. And we're not I look at a lot of different kind of I'll give you an example. So the Grameen Bank, when it was founded, Muhammad Yunus, he tells a story in his book where he was in a village in Bangladesh, and he met this woman. She was weaving a basket and selling the baskets, but most of the profit was going to the loan shark, because that's going to access the mainstream economy, right? So he himself at that moment wanted to give her, if he gave her $20, it would have, fixed her life in many ways. That would have helped her, and he would have felt good as well. But ultimately, he took a step back and he said, that's not what she's asking for. She's not asking for a charity. She's not asking to be helped in this way. What she, along with every single other woman, is asking for to be included into the economy.
Right.
And that's what led him to starting this microfinance institutions, right? To give access to women, to the financial system. So that in itself, the technical solution was to give her that, that money. The adaptive solution is to understand, okay, women are not able to access the financial institutions. Let me come up with a solution that will allow for women to actually thrive.
Right.
Goes back to disability. Disability community is not asking for a charity or pity or to, we are asking to be seen as valued member of society. We're asking to access. We're asking to be included. And so if we look at solutions where it's very much through a charity lens, that's actually hurting us more than helping us. So that's when I say there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to inclusion.
Absolutely, and I feel like marginalized groups, we should come together and have this conversation together. I mean, in unity there's strength, and so we need to have these conversations, more and more in an academic setting, in a friendly setting, in a policy setting, to see how inclusion can be, sustainable and long-term together.
Exactly. We should come together, and then we should also include, the mainstream kind of system. As we always say, when we talk about women issues, we shouldn't just be, as women, talking, having an echo chamber. How do we make sure we actually include the others, the rest of the community? And I would say the same thing with disability. Let's make sure we are engaging everyone and engaging not just persons with disabilities, but everyone. Because that we need to be able to bring that narrative to the mainstream kind of space.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One story that really resonated with me on this point is, I was in grad school and we were in a classroom full of 100 students, and they had name cards, and that allowed us, with the name cards, allowed people to be able to better participate. And in the beginning of the semester, I told my classmates, "Hey guys, can you please say your name when you speak, because it's going to allow me to be able to participate." Mm-hmm. And the professor was like, "No." And I was like, "What do you mean no?" He's like, "The way you phrase it is as if they're doing you a favor, mm-hmm. But making the classroom accessible for you." He's like, you need to, by them making that classroom accessible to you, by you contributing, they're benefiting from your contribution. So actually, they're doing themselves a favor. And that for me was a really huge shift in my own mind. That was a huge turning moment in my own mind when I understood what inclusion meant.
Absolutely, but I mean, in a setting where you were told that you were asking for something and that was the answer, it's amazing that that was a turning point for you. No, I mean, it
was very. Of course, when he said no, I was like, "What do you mean no?"
Exactly. What do you mean?
My advocacy side came out. It's like, "What do you mean? It's my right." But then the way he phrased it,
yeah,
it was such an enlightening moment. But this is the thing, Karma. I've always felt, and sometimes I do feel, when I'm asking to access this space, as if this space is doing me a favor by making it accessible. That's we need to shift that, and if we shift that shifts actually how inclusion is achieved and seen. So, anyways, that's
No, but this story really, it also, for me, it's such a mind opener. Thank you for sharing this. I wanted to ask you for maybe another anecdote or another story that you can share from your life on the importance of inclusion in decision making, where you saw that, because a lot of time is spent trying for us to prove that we need to be included, right? We spend a lot of energy saying we need to include women on peace tables. We need to have disability inclusion, as if it's like, it has to come naturally, right? But we spend a lot of energy on that. And unfortunately, hopefully one day we won't have jobs anymore and we can retire because this mission would be fulfilled, right? Whether it's disability inclusion or inclusion as a whole. But what example can you give me? What story can you share with us from your own life where you showed how important this is to everyone around you?
That's a good question. This was also in grad school, and one of my professors said, "Sara, you're going to enter a space, and as a blind Muslim woman, you're going to be dealing with a lot of labels and dealing with, with certain narratives. And that's the reality." But he said that if you enter a space and you truly believe that you belong there and you have value to contribute, you will ultimately shift the narrative in how people are seeing you over time. Mm-hmm. But if you enter this space and you don't feel like you belong and you're allowing the narrative to impact how you're being seen, then it's going to be a vicious cycle of being marginalized. And yes, his words were very powerful, but then I took it a step further and I started reflecting. And I think there's two sides to this, to this aspect. One is, I think we as individuals need to be on this journey of embracing all of who we are and seeing the value of who we are. And that's a journey. It's not a switch of a button, and I wish it was a switch of a button. And I think that is constant work on making sure we are understanding who we are for who we are, not how society sees us. And I think the more we do that, the more we're able to then come into a space and understand our value. But then on the other hand, I think we need to also be part of creating that space for others. Right. So when we enter a space, we need to be very much become allies towards other voices and other marginalized voices. And when we're in a space, we need to make sure we're allowing for people to bring their voice forward and to be advocate for others and allies for others. And and I think that is very important. We all have the power within us to create that space for others to bring their true self forward. So I think the more we do that, even on an individual level, or even on a organization, whatever level you have impact, that is very powerful.
Thank you for sharing that. In one of your YouTube videos, Sara, you asked the audience what motivated them. Well, I'm going to ask you, what motivates you? What keeps you going? What keeps pushing you forward every day?
For me, I think, one is I understand how much empowerment, like being empowered and being supported and being valued, how much that's impacted how I see where I am in my life. And that's a big part of why motivates me in my work when I see people not being included or empowered. It just really, it's a big part of kind of my motivation in all of my work. And the work of disability inclusion can be very emotionally tiring at times and frustrating in the sense that, why don't people get it?
Yeah. Why don't they get it?
But ultimately, when you see, truly believe that every single person and every single child in this world has something beautiful to contribute. And when the world is not seeing that beauty and that, and that value, that for me is what motivates me to keep on doing the work that we're doing.
Well, Sara, thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for keeping us motivated. Thank you for being so inspiring. And I want to thank you again for accepting this invitation and being our guest on the Diplowomen podcast.
Amazing. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you for having me.